It was past midnight on the fourth-floor memory unit when the 79-year-old woman caught the night nurse's sleeve and pulled her down close, her voice low, as though the walls might be listening. "Someone wants to hurt my boy," she said. "When you leave here, they'll come. You have to stay." In her chart, it had been written down as confusion, medicated, and set aside. Only one person on that floor refused to set it aside, and that same person had filed 3 requests to be transferred off the ward, and had been denied all 3 times. Because the old woman's son is the most powerful man on Federal Hill, a 34-year-old boss whose name this city still says quietly. For 10 years he has been searching for one name, and for 10 years he has been looking in the wrong places. Because the only person who ever saw that face was sitting in his own kitchen, and he had decided she was no longer making sense. The chief of neurology has no interest in the warnings of a dementia patient. He cares about a different question. Why a flight ICU nurse who once worked on a medical transport helicopter would voluntarily take the night shift on a memory unit at 30% less pay. In 20 years of practice, he has only ever seen one kind of person make that choice. Then, at 1:20 in the morning, an ambulance pulls up outside the hospital, and it turns out the old woman had been right for 2 months. She was just the last person in the world, including herself, to understand what she was actually warning them about. If you love stories about quiet courage, hit like on this video. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story reaches you, share it with someone who needs reminding that they still matter. Maeve Donnelly didn't pull her hand away. That was the first thing she had learned on this floor, and also the hardest. When someone with dementia grabs hold of you in the middle of the night, most people's instinct is to free themselves quickly, neatly, then step half a pace back. The old woman would understand that step backward. She might not remember your name, but she would remember the feeling of being let go. So Maeve left her hand where it was inside the woman's grasp, then reached up and switched off the ceiling light. The room sank into the dull yellow glow of the small lamp on the wall. She pulled the plastic chair closer, sat down, and lowered herself until her eyes were level with the woman's. In that position, one person was no longer standing above the other, looking down. "Mrs. Adesi," she said. "You can hear my voice, can't you?" Nella Adesi was still staring toward the door. Her hand tightened. "They'll come when you leave. It's 12:40 in the morning. The floor doors have been locked since 10 o'clock. No one can come up here without me knowing. You don't understand. Then tell me." Her voice stayed even. No faster, no slower. "Take your time. I'm sitting right here." It was an old trick. You couldn't soothe fear with logic. You could only sit beside it until it grew tired. Nella began to speak, and her story wandered in circles, the way this illness always forced memory to wander. A piece of the kitchen, a piece of winter, a piece of her husband, who had died 10 years earlier, but whom she still mentioned, as if he had only stepped out to buy cigarettes. Maeve didn't correct her. No one gained anything from correcting them. She only counted the rhythm of her own breathing, and let the old woman hold on to that rhythm. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out. By the 3rd sentence, Nella's breathing had begun to slow with hers. By the 6th, her fingers had loosened. 7 minutes later, she was asleep. Maeve eased her hand free from the woman's, one finger at a time. Out in the hallway, the harsh white light returned. She stood in front of the medication cart, opened the electronic chart, and typed into the night shift notes the same sentence she had typed 11 times in 2 months. Patient agitated during nighttime hours. Duration approximately 15 minutes. Managed without medication. Stable. No further intervention required. She left the cursor there longer than necessary. There was another field beneath it, one reserved for the content of the patient's speech. The person on the previous shift had already entered a single phrase, abbreviated in the careless way people wrote when their hands had become too accustomed to the work. Delusional. Repetitive. Maeve didn't change it. Changing it would mean explaining, and explaining would mean answering a question she wasn't allowed to answer inside this building. Because the old woman hadn't been speaking nonsense at all. She had been talking about a real person. Maeve closed the chart, walked down the hall, pushed open the staff break room door, and opened her locker. The request form was there, folded into quarters beneath a box of spare gloves. She took it out, unfolded it, and read it again for a time she had stopped counting. Request for work area transfer. Donnelly, M. RN. Decision. Denied. Reason. Insufficient number of night shift nurses with resuscitation certification. Please reapply after 90 days. The 3rd time, the same pre-written reason, the same scanned signature, the same blurred patch of ink in the upper right corner that was almost certainly caused by the printer rather than by anyone holding a pen. 90 days. That was the funny part. If a person was tired enough to find it funny, they gave her a waiting period, as though sometime during those 90 days the name Adesi on the assignment board might disappear on its own. She had seen that name on the first morning the old woman was admitted, printed in bold on the 4th line of the new patient list, and she had stood frozen in front of the assignment board long enough for the head nurse to ask if she was all right. She said it was nothing. Then she went home and filed the transfer request that same afternoon. She had now been working on this floor for 11 months, caring for that woman for 2 months, and had been denied 3 times. Maeve folded the paper back along its 4 old creases, placed it at the bottom of the locker, and closed the door. She didn't slam it. She had never slammed anything in her life. Then she took the compression glove from her pocket and pulled it over her left hand. The fabric tightened around her palm, pressing against skin that would never lie smooth again, and for the first 30 seconds it always hurt a little. Then the pain passed. She had worn it for 10 years. No one at St. Bridget's had ever asked why. Out there, in room 412, the 79-year-old woman was asleep, and inside her mind, an 18-year-old girl was still standing in the hallway of another hospital 10 years earlier, her left hand wrapped in bandages. Maeve switched off the break room light and stepped back into the hallway. 5 hours remained before the end of her shift. At 3 o'clock in the morning, while Maeve was recounting the medication vials in the second drawer of the medication room, the door behind her opened and didn't close again. She knew who it was before she turned around. On this floor, there was only one person who entered a room without knocking, and only one who remained standing in the doorway, instead of stepping fully inside. Dr. Whitman Kessler stood there with a file tucked beneath one arm, his white coat still sharply pressed at 3 o'clock in the morning in the way only the coats of people who slept in the on-call room ever were. "Miss Donnelly, I have a few minutes, and you appear to be free." Maeve closed the drawer and locked it. "I'm doing inventory." "Inventory doesn't require you to answer questions. You can do both." He didn't wait for her agreement. He opened the file without looking down at it, and Maeve understood immediately that he had memorized everything written inside. Critical Care Nursing Certification, issued 4 years ago. Emergency Certification, 4 years in emergency medicine and trauma-intensive care at a Level 1 trauma center. Then, 2 years on an air critical care transport team. He looked up. "You flew. You sat inside the cabin of a medical helicopter and kept people alive at an altitude of 300 meters in darkness and crosswinds. Have I said anything incorrectly?" "No." "Good. Then this is the part I find difficult to understand." He closed the file. 11 months ago, you applied to St. Brigid's and requested the night shift on the 4th floor memory care unit. Not emergency, not intensive care, memory care. A salary 30% lower than what you earned before. No helicopter, no critical cases, no one dying in your hands at 2 o'clock in the morning unless age itself decided it was time. Maeve didn't answer. She opened the 3rd drawer and began counting again from the beginning, even though she had finished counting that drawer 10 minutes earlier. "People tend to think I'm the kind of doctor who distrusts employees because they don't have enough qualifications," Kessler said. "That's boring. Your case is exactly the opposite. You have too many. So many that they're abnormal for the job you're doing. And in 20 years of practicing medicine, I've seen only one kind of person voluntarily step 3 levels below what they're capable of doing and accept the loss of 1/3 of their income." He let the sentence hang there just long enough. Someone running from a bad outcome. There were 22 vials in the 3rd drawer. Maeve counted all 22 before she spoke, and her voice wasn't even slightly higher than it had been before. "Dr. Kessler, what exactly are you asking me?" "I haven't asked you anything yet. I've only described what I see. Then I don't need to answer anything yet either." The slight curl at the corner of his mouth wasn't a smile. It was the expression of a man who had just heard exactly what he had been waiting to hear. "Mrs. Adesi has become agitated 6 nights in the past 2 weeks. All 6 happened during your shifts, and all 6 were managed without a single dose of medication. The evening shift, nurses use medication an average of twice a week. I've read every one of your notes. They're precise, concise, and they don't explain why you can do what no one else on this floor seems able to do. I sit down until I'm at eye level with her, and I don't pull my hand away. Anyone can do that. Not everyone can. That's the point." Kessler took 1 step into the room, and for the first time, he was no longer blocking the doorway. "I don't like gaps in personnel records, not because I think people are dishonest, because in my profession, a gap is usually where someone has buried something, and when that thing digs its way back up, it always chooses the busiest night to do it." He pulled a printed sheet from the file, placed it face down on the work counter, and turned the top of the page toward her. Then he tapped it once with 2 fingers, the way someone places a chess piece after already calculating the next move. I'm leaving this here for you. You don't have to say anything to me about it. You don't have to say anything to me for the rest of this month if you don't want to. He had reached the door before he turned back. But if there ever comes a night when everything on my floor goes wrong, I want to know beforehand who I'm standing beside. I hope the rest of your shift stays quiet, miss. Donnelly. The door closed. Maeve stood motionless in the medication room for a very long time, one hand still resting on the drawer handle. She didn't need to turn the page over. She had already seen the reversed lettering showing faintly through the back when he rotated it toward her. 2 words that were enough to tell her everything else. It was a printout of a local news article from 14 months earlier about a medical helicopter that had crashed into a field 40 kilometers west of the hospital at 11 o'clock at night, in the rain. A crew of 4. One person walked away. For the remaining 5 hours of her shift, the paper stayed face down on the work counter. Maeve passed it no fewer than 30 times. She administered medication, changed intravenous fluids, helped a patient to the bathroom at 4:30, wrote notes, took blood pressure readings, and every time she passed that counter, she didn't look down. It wasn't until 6:15, when the day shift began arriving, and the sound of the first cart rolled in from the far end of the hallway, that she finally stopped in front of the desk. She picked up the paper, folded it into quarters exactly the way she folded everything, and slipped it into her pocket. Not because she wanted to read it, but because if she left it there, someone else would read it by 7 o'clock. And what Maeve Donnelly had lost in the medication room that night wasn't her secret. The secret was still intact. What she had lost was the right to be left alone with it. The sheet of paper folded into quarters was still in Maeve's pocket when she returned to the 4th floor the following night, and she still hadn't opened it once. At 11 o'clock at night, half the hallway lights had already been turned off. The floor doors had been locked for an hour, and everything was moving to the slow, familiar rhythm of a shift in which nothing was happening. Then the elevator opened at the far end of the hall. The night security guard sitting at the desk near the entrance to the floor looked up, saw who stepped out, then lowered his eyes again. He didn't ask for identification. He didn't mention that visiting hours had ended at 8 o'clock. He simply found something on his computer screen to make himself look busy, and the way he did it said more than any explanation could have. 3 men stepped out of the elevator. 2 stopped beside the waiting chairs and sat down without saying a word. The third continued alone toward room 412. Maeve was standing in the middle of the hallway with the medication cart. She had about 4 seconds to decide what to do, and she spent all 4 of them standing perfectly still, like someone who had suddenly forgotten what she had been about to do. Then she pushed the cart into the medication room, pulled the door almost closed, and left a gap no wider than a hand. The man passed through her view beyond that narrow opening, less than 2 meters away. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat, and he walked with the unhurried pace of a man who never needed to move quickly because no one had ever made him wait. He didn't look toward the medication room. He didn't look anywhere except the door at the end of the hallway. Maeve leaned back against the intravenous fluid cabinet, closed her eyes, and did exactly what she always taught her patients to do. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out. By the 3rd round, her hands had stopped trembling. By the 5th, she opened her eyes and began rearranging medication boxes that were already arranged. In room 412, Nicholas Adesi pulled a chair close to his mother's bed and sat down. He didn't turn on the light. He didn't call for a nurse. He held her hand the way someone holds something fragile, and he sat like that for 40 minutes, silent most of the time. Twice, she woke and said something, and both times he answered in a voice so low that not a single word could be heard from the hallway. Around midnight, her breathing evened out again. He stayed another 10 minutes after she had fallen asleep, then stood, pulled the blanket up to her chest, and left the room. Maeve had come out of the medication room by then. She didn't have a choice, because room 408 had just pressed the call button. And a nurse couldn't hide in the medication room for an entire shift. She was pushing the medication cart down the hallway when he came toward her from the opposite direction. They passed each other in the narrow stretch near room 406, exactly 1 step apart. He leaned to his left to give her room. She leaned to her right. His eyes moved over her face, over the employee badge on her chest, and then moved on. There was nothing in that look at all. No recognition, no suspicion, not a trace of 10 years. He continued toward the elevator. The 2 men by the waiting chairs rose and followed him, and the elevator doors closed. Maeve pushed the cart another 7 steps before she had to stop, both hands gripping the horizontal bar until the hallway stopped tilting. She worked for the next 2 hours and didn't make a single mistake in her notes. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the call bell from room 412 rang. Nella Adesi was sitting upright with both legs hanging over the edge of the bed, trying to pull the intravenous line from her arm. "It's too late," she said when Maeve entered. "I have to go home. Saturday nights are always busy. If I don't go back, who's going to cook?" Maeve didn't restrain her hands. She pulled the plastic chair over, sat down half a head lower than the old woman, and said only one thing. "What were you planning to cook tonight?" The old woman stopped. That was always the only opening, and it stayed open for about 3 seconds. "Ragu," she said. "You have to start it in the afternoon or it won't be ready. Then tell me how you make it." And while the old woman talked, through broken sentences and places where her memory slipped away and then managed to catch hold again, Maeve began to hum, very softly. No words, only the melody. An old Italian song in triple time. The kind of song people sang in kitchens rather than on stages. Nella fell silent. She tilted her head and listened. By the second phrase, her hands had stopped twisting together. By the end of the first round, she had begun nodding with the rhythm. 4 minutes later, she lay back down, and Maeve pulled the blanket over her. When she turned toward the door, Dr. Kessler was standing in the doorway. How long he had been there, she didn't know. He didn't come inside. He only looked at the old woman sleeping. Then at Maeve. "Where did you learn that song?" "From a former patient." The answer came out too quickly. Maeve heard it herself. Kessler didn't respond immediately. He looked at her longer than politeness allowed, the way someone looks when comparing something he has just heard with something he has just seen and discovering the place where the two don't fit. "No," he said at last, very calmly. "You know the words." Aldo Mancuso was 61 years old and had spent much of his life waiting in hallways of one kind or another, but he had never learned to feel at ease in hospital corridors. At 4 o'clock the following afternoon, he stood against the stretch of wall between room 412 and the emergency stairwell door, both hands clasped behind his back, his eyes turned toward the window at the far end of the hall, though he wasn't really looking at anything. Nico had been inside for 15 minutes. The driver stood 3 steps away, halfway through some story about the car, about the 6 o'clock appointment, about how the road into Federal Hill was always jammed at this hour, and Aldo was answering with quiet acknowledgments in all the right places, the way people do when their mind is somewhere else entirely. The door to room 412 was open about the width of a hand, enough for voices from inside to carry into the hallway. "Mrs. Adesi was speaking. She was talking to her son in the soothing voice she had used with him since the days when he hadn't yet been tall enough to reach her shoulder, her tone rising and falling in the way of someone trying to put back in order a story that had been tangled in her mind for a very long time. Then, in the middle of a sentence, she said one word. "Bertie came. I saw her twice already. Are you listening to me?" Aldo had been halfway through a sentence of his own. He stopped in the middle of it. The driver waited for him to finish, and when he didn't, asked again. Aldo raised one hand to chest level, palm down, and the driver fell silent. Inside the room, Nico answered in a voice too low to make out from the hall, and the old woman continued with the offended impatience of someone who had said the same thing too many times, and no longer believed anyone would ever believe her. Then she moved on to something else. Something about winter. Something about a pot. And the name she had just spoken drifted away into the murky current of her thoughts as though it had never surfaced at all. But Aldo Mancuso had heard it. There are names a man carries in his mind for so long that they stop being names and become drawers. And he knows exactly where each one sits and which key opens it. 10 years earlier, 3 days after the funeral, Nico had called him into a room and given him one task: find the woman who had been in the kitchen that night. She had left behind only one word, and that word wasn't anyone's real name, but it was all Nico could remember from the final 3 minutes before he lost consciousness. Aldo had searched. He searched for 3 years. He went through employee lists, handwritten timesheets, former waiters who had since scattered across 4 states, even places a decent man would never think to look. And then, in the 3rd year, he found something. After that, he stopped. He told Nico the trail had gone cold, that the woman might have left the city, might have changed her name, might not want to be found. He had practiced those 3 possibilities in the car for an entire afternoon before walking into the room. Nico believed him, because in 15 years Aldo Mancuso had never lied to him about anything, and that was precisely why the only lie he had ever told him passed so easily. For 7 years he hadn't opened that drawer again. Now, standing in the 4th floor hallway of St. Brigid's, he heard that word spoken by an old woman the entire hospital believed was no longer fully lucid, and he felt something very much like missing a stair in the dark, because there were 2 possibilities. The first was that the old woman was confused. and the name was nothing more than a fragment floating up from years of hearing her son repeat it over and over. The second was one Aldo didn't want to consider, but he had lived long enough to know that true coincidences were far rarer than people liked to believe. He turned and walked back down the hallway toward the nurse's station. There, pinned to the corkboard beside the blood pressure machine, was the weekly shift schedule. Aldo stopped in front of it like a man checking a room number. He took his phone from the inside pocket of his coat, raised it, and took a picture. 1. Then he enlarged the image on the screen, checked that the writing was clear, and took another to be certain. The night shift column. 3 nights that week. The same name. He didn't ask anyone a single question. He didn't speak to the nurse on duty. Didn't ask about the old woman's condition. Didn't do anything that might make people remember him. He simply slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned to the same place in the hallway. 3 minutes later, the door to room 412 opened, and a female nurse went in to take the old woman's blood pressure before shift change. Aldo watched through the small square window in the door. She sat down half a head lower than the old woman, said something, and Mrs. Adesi smiled. It was the first time all afternoon that Aldo Mancuso had seen her smile. He stood perfectly still, his hands still clasped behind his back, and inside his mind, after 7 years, a drawer was pulled open from where it had been kept. The shift ended at 7 o'clock, but that night Maeve finished handing over her patients by 6:20, and she didn't drive toward her apartment. She went the other way, crossed the bridge, turned onto the steep road leading up to Federal Hill, and did it without looking at a single street sign. 5 o'clock in the morning was the only time this neighborhood ever agreed to be quiet. The bakeries still had 2 hours before opening. The streetlights were still on. She drove slowly through the middle of the neighborhood and parked along the curb across from a 2-story red brick building with a striped fabric awning and 4 sets of iron tables and chairs arranged on the sidewalk. Hanging above the door was a wooden sign with a name written in gold script. She turned off the engine. Then she sat there without moving. This building didn't look like the one that had once stood here. It was half a story taller, its facade set back about 1 meter from the sidewalk, and the front entrance was now off to the left, instead of directly in the center. Someone had rebuilt it properly, with the money of people who knew what they were doing, and now no one looking at it would ever guess that 9 years earlier this place had been nothing more than a fenced-off, empty lot. Maeve sat in the car for 40 minutes. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't get out. She kept both hands on the steering wheel and watched the building the way people watch something they have watched many times before, from this exact spot, at this exact hour, often enough to know that at 5:45, a light would come on in the rear ground floor window. At 5:45, the light came on. A few minutes later, a young man in an apron pushed open the door, carried the 4 sets of iron tables and chairs into their proper places, wiped down the tabletops, then looked up and noticed the car parked across the street. He hesitated for a moment before crossing over and bending down beside the window. Maeve lowered the glass. "Morning. Are you waiting for someone?" "No, we don't open until 7, but the kitchen will have fresh bread out by 6:30. If you want breakfast, I can leave the door open for you." "Thank you. I'm not eating." He nodded, wished her a good day, and went back across the street. Maeve watched him disappear inside. Then she started the engine. Before pulling away, she turned her head to the right and looked toward the alley running along the side of the building. There was now a row of lidded trash bins and a gray-painted steel door fitted with a motion sensor light, standing roughly 7 meters from the mouth of the alley, in the exact spot the old wooden door had once stood. Maeve looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, no longer, then faced forward again and drove away. By the time she reached her apartment, it was after 6:30. She hung her coat on the hook, took off her shoes, and went straight into the kitchen. She turned on the hot water, filled the basin, and waited until steam began to rise. Then she removed the compression glove from her left hand and lowered her hand into the water. It was always the same. The first 20 seconds were the worst, when skin that had been compressed all night was suddenly released and the blood rushed back, and then the warmth spread through it, and the discomfort eased. She stood there with one hand braced against the edge of the sink and the other soaking in the water, thinking about the motion sensor light above the gray steel door. There hadn't been a light there before. Back then, when she was 18 years old and had just taken her first job after aging out of the state foster care system, that alley had been so dark that people had to keep one hand against the wall to avoid tripping over beer crates. She had walked through it every night for 3 weeks. She knew where the concrete was cracked. She knew the kitchen door had to be pushed with a shoulder rather than a hand, because the hinges sagged. Those were the kinds of details a server learned in 3 days and never forgot again. even when that door had been torn down 9 years earlier and replaced by a new steel one with a light above it. The water in the basin slowly cooled. Maeve lifted her hand out, dried it, and didn't put the glove back on. She never wore it at home. She poured herself a glass of water, didn't drink it, set it on the table, and sat down in the armchair beside the window. Outside, daylight had fully arrived. She meant to sit there for 10 minutes, then take a shower and sleep properly in her bed like an adult who knew how to take care of herself. She fell asleep in the chair at 7 o'clock, still wearing her nursing uniform, her left hand hanging over the armrest with her palm facing upward. In her pocket, the printed sheet folded into quarters was still exactly where it had been, and she still hadn't opened it once. The following night began so normally that Maeve would later remember exactly what she had been thinking at 12:30, and what she had thought was that the night was quiet, and maybe she would finish her notes before 4 o'clock. Then, at 1:20, the sound of an ambulance siren rose from the rear courtyard of the hospital, and 3 minutes later, the radio at the 4th floor nurses' station crackled out a sequence of codes that anyone who had ever worked emergency medicine recognized immediately. Tomas Reyes looked up. "They're asking for backup downstairs. Do we have anyone free up here?" Maeve was already on her feet before he finished the sentence. It wasn't a decision. It was something older than decision. Something 4 years in emergency medicine had planted in a person's legs and never quite removed. She took the stairs because the elevator would cost her 30 seconds. The emergency department on the ground floor was bright white and crowded in the way it only became on nights exactly like this one. A stretcher had just been pushed through the doors. The paramedic was giving handoff in a loud, level voice, the kind people trained themselves to use so the words would keep moving in a straight line when everything else was bending out of shape. Male, 34 years old, single vehicle accident, lost control, struck the median on the beltway, no entrapment, conscious at the scene for several minutes, then increasingly drowsy during transport. Blood pressure on loading was 90/60, now 70/40, pulse 130, skin cold, clammy, gray, abdomen rigid. Maeve stopped in the doorway. She had stopped at the threshold of emergency rooms many times in her life, but this time her feet stopped before her eyes had time to tell her brain why. The man on the stretcher was Nicholas Adesi. There was a moment, too brief to be measured by anything in that room, when 10 years of Maeve Donnelly's life folded in half and touched itself. There was smoke inside those 10 years, and the sound of metal, and a kitchen door that had to be pushed with a shoulder, and 3 weeks of wages on a cash payroll, and one word she had spoken in the dark, and never spoken again for the rest of her life. Then the moment closed, and she did what she had been trained to do. She stepped forward and took hold of the fluid bag. "Second line," the attending physician said. "Whoever can get one, do it now." "I can." Her voice came out level and steady, not even half a note higher. She got access in the left antecubital vein on the first attempt, secured the catheter, opened the fluids wide, then stepped back half a pace to make room for the ultrasound machine. The probe moved across his abdomen. On the screen, the thing no one wanted to see appeared on the second pass. A dark space in a place where there should never have been dark space at all. Free fluid. A lot. The attending didn't look up. "Call the operating room. Tell them emergency laparotomy. Suspected solid organ rupture. Get blood ready. We're going now." After that, everything moved very fast, and Maeve moved with it. She pushed the stretcher into the hallway, held the fluid bag above her head, repeated medication doses when someone asked, and during the entire 4-minute trip to the surgical elevator, she didn't look down at the face of the man on the stretcher even once. Not because she didn't want to, because she knew exactly what would happen to her hands if she did. The operating room doors swallowed the stretcher. Someone thanked her. Someone told her to go back upstairs because they had enough people down here now. Maeve said yes, and she didn't go back upstairs. She stepped out into the corridor outside surgery, where 2 rows of molded plastic chairs were fixed to the wall, and a small red light hung above the doorframe. The light that meant there was an open case underway inside. She stood. She didn't sit. She pressed her hands together, palm to palm, laced her fingers, and held them that way in front of her chest. It was the only way she knew to make her hands stay still when they no longer had anything to do. Inside, they were opening his abdomen and finding the source of the bleeding. She knew the order of every step. She knew what they would suction first, knew where they would clamp, knew that if it was the spleen they would remove it rather than try to save it, knew that when blood pressure dropped that low there was no longer time to consider which option might be more elegant. She knew all of it, and she couldn't do anything. That was the worst part. And she had known that worst part since 14 months earlier, in a field 40 kilometers west of here, in the rain. when she had been the only person still able to stand and all she could do was stand. The phone in her pocket vibrated once. Tomas had sent a message asking if she was still downstairs, because someone on the 4th floor had pressed a call bell. She replied that she would be up immediately. Then she didn't go up. 3 hours and 40 minutes later, the red light above the door frame went dark. The door opened, and a surgeon stepped out, pulled his mask down beneath his chin, and spoke to the nurse beside him loudly enough for Maeve to hear. Splenectomy, bleeding controlled, pressures coming up. He said something else that Maeve didn't quite catch, then walked toward the changing room. Maeve Donnelly remained standing in the corridor for a little while longer, beneath the darkened red light. Then she let her hands fall apart, saw that they had stopped trembling, and went back up to the 4th floor to answer the call bell that had been waiting for her there. At 6 o'clock in the morning, just after Maeve finished writing the last line of her shift notes, the night charge nurse called her into the small office beside the nurse's station and didn't ask her to sit, because she herself hadn't sat down since 10 o'clock the night before. On the desk lay a hastily printed assignment sheet, the ink still warm. The patient who just had the splenectomy has been transferred down from recovery. They've placed him in the enhanced monitoring room in the East Wing, 4th floor. Same floor as you. Maeve looked at the paper. On the second line, beside the room number, was his name, typed out in full, surname included. I need a critical care certified nurse to stay with him during the first 48 hours. Hospital policy requires it after emergency abdominal surgery involving massive blood transfusion. She pushed the paper toward Maeve. On the 4th floor night shift, the person with that certification is you. Only you. What about Marguerite in the West Wing? Marguerite has been on maternity leave since last Monday. What about someone from intensive care? Intensive care is at capacity, and they've refused to take another monitoring case. I called. Twice. She braced both hands on the desk. Miss Donnelly, I've been here since 10 o'clock last night, and I don't like this list any more than you do. Maeve stood still for several seconds. Then she spoke, trying to make her voice sound like an ordinary administrative request. I'd like to ask for a switch. I can take the entire West Wing, all 14 rooms, including the higher acuity patients. In exchange, someone else can cover the monitoring room. Switch with whom? There was no malice in the question. It was only a question, and there was no answer to it. And both women in that small office understood that at the same moment. Give me a name and I'll sign the change right now, the charge nurse said. Maeve couldn't give her one. Then I can't change it. I'm sorry. It's not that I don't want to. She slid a pen across the desk. Sign the acknowledgement column for me. And that made 4 times. The previous 3 had been typed transfer requests, folded into quarters, and kept beneath the box of gloves in her locker, each one separated from the next by 90 days. This time it took only 40 seconds. And there wasn't even another piece of paper. Maeve picked up the pen. She looked at the acknowledgement column, at the empty box beside his name, and thought about telling the truth right there, in that room, to the decent, exhausted woman standing across from her. It would take only 1 sentence. I used to work for this family. I was there the night his father died. But she had calculated that move many times over the past 11 months, and it always led to the same place. If she said it now, people would ask why she had waited until now to say anything. They would go back through 11 months of her caring for his mother without speaking a word. And the first people to hear about it wouldn't be hospital administration. It would be the 2 men who sat in the waiting chairs at the end of the hallway every time Nicholas Adesi came to visit his mother. Maeve signed her name in the empty box. Her handwriting was steady, slightly slanted to the right, without a tremor anywhere. She handed the pen back, took the assignment sheet, said thank you, and left the office. Dr. Whitman Kessler was standing at the nurse's station outside, holding a paper cup of coffee, his eyes directed at the patient list on the screen. But he had been there long enough to hear everything. He made no attempt to hide the fact that he had heard. He didn't comment on it either. He only looked at the assignment sheet in Maeve's hand, looked at the acknowledgement column now bearing her signature, and took a sip of coffee. In Whitman Kessler's mind, everything had just fallen neatly into place, and every part of it was completely wrong. He had a nurse whose qualifications were so far beyond her current position that it was abnormal. He had 11 months of work in memory care, where no one died at 2 o'clock in the morning because of a wrong decision made in 30 seconds. He had a newspaper article about 4 people who had flown out and 1 who had walked away, a page he had placed face down on the nurse's station desk, and she hadn't said a single word to him about it. And now he had this detail too. A woman like that, on the night the hospital sent the most serious case of the week back to her floor, had tried to get out of it, had failed to get out of it, and had signed anyway. He placed that detail exactly where he believed it belonged. This person is afraid of critical cases. This person broke once and still hasn't managed to stand back up. And if she is still broken somewhere inside, the enhanced monitoring room is the worst place in the world for that damage to reveal itself. Kessler set down his coffee, opened the electronic charting system, and did something he rarely did with the nurses under his supervision. He turned on notifications for himself every time a new note was entered into the chart for the 4th floor East Wing enhanced monitoring room, no matter what time it was. He had completely misunderstood why Maeve Donnelly had signed her name beside that assignment. But because he misunderstood it, from 6 o'clock that morning onward, he became the person watching her more closely than anyone else in the building, including the 61-year-old man carrying 2 photographs of the shift schedule on his phone. That night, Maeve came on shift at 7 o'clock, and there were already 2 people in the enhanced monitoring room in the East Wing. The first was lying in the bed, asleep under the effects of medication, with an abdominal drain and 3 monitoring lines connected to the screen. The second was sitting in the armchair beside the window, a thin blanket over her legs, and that was the part Maeve hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Adesi had been moved from room 412 into this room that afternoon. No one had asked anyone for permission. She had demanded it. And in this hospital, when that family name demanded something that could reasonably be arranged, people arranged it. Maeve looked at mother and son in the same room, 3 meters apart, and understood that the next 48 hours were going to be far more difficult than she had imagined. She worked. It was the only thing she knew how to do under circumstances like these, and she did it carefully. At 9 o'clock, vital signs, note entered. At 10 o'clock, drain output checked, note entered. At 11 o'clock, surgical dressing checked, lungs auscultated, note entered. She kept the lights as low as possible while still being able to see. She moved in soft-soled shoes, and never raised her voice. At 1:45 midnight, Mrs. Adesi drifted to sleep in the chair. At 1 o'clock in the morning, everything was still quiet. Then, at around 1:20, the same hour that had brought him into this building exactly 1 day earlier, Nicholas Adesi's breathing changed. Maeve was standing at the foot of the bed entering numbers into the tablet. She looked up. On the monitor, his pulse was climbing from 92 to 109. His eyes opened, but it was the kind of open-eyed state Maeve had seen many times before, and it didn't mean he was awake. His right hand found the bed rail and gripped it until his knuckles turned white. Mr. Adesi. He didn't hear her. He was somewhere else, and that place wasn't this room. His breathing grew shorter, faster, the breathing of a man running while his body remained still. His head turned to one side, his chin lifting slightly as though he were trying to avoid something above his face. Mr. Adesi, you're at St. Bridget's. You've just had surgery. You're safe. Nothing changed. Pulse 114. Then he began to count. Very softly, distorted by the medication and the dryness in his throat, but clearly enough that there was no mistaking it. He inhaled and counted 4 beats. He held and counted 4 beats. He exhaled. Then he started again. Maeve stood frozen at the foot of the bed with the tablet in her hands. There were many ways to count breathing. People taught 6 counts, with an exhale longer than the inhale. People taught the 4-7-8 method. People taught 10 different techniques, and every hospital had one it preferred. The rhythm coming from this bed wasn't a hospital technique. It was the rhythm used by one person trying to keep another person conscious while they waited, when both of them knew that the only thing they could control in that moment was breathing. And the rhythm was counted evenly, 4-4-4, because it was simple enough to remember even while someone was losing blood. She knew that rhythm very well. She had counted it aloud in a smoke-filled kitchen 10 years earlier, until her voice had gone hoarse. The pulse on the monitor stopped at 116, then began to fall. 110, 103, 98. He was bringing himself back down with that rhythm alone, without anyone helping him, following something buried deeper than memory itself. And when his breathing had settled again, he said one word. It wasn't a call. It sounded more like the way someone says the name of a person standing beside them. Birdie. The tablet tilted in Maeve's hands, and she had to catch it with both hands before it fell to the floor. From the armchair by the window came the soft rustle of a blanket. Mrs. Adesi was awake, or half awake. In that strange half-state the illness sometimes released people into around midnight, and took back again before dawn. She looked toward Maeve, standing at the foot of the bed. And in that low light she saw a young woman, whose face she had known for 2 months, and she placed that woman into the only empty space left in her mind. Is that you? Maeve didn't answer. I knew it, Mrs. Adesi said, very calmly, as though she were simply continuing a conversation that had been interrupted the day before. I told you already. I told you so many times. Then she pulled the blanket higher and fell asleep again so quickly that Maeve didn't have time to say a single word. The following morning, when the day shift arrived and someone asked Mrs. Adesi whether she had slept well, she said she had slept beautifully, and she remembered nothing at all. Maeve remained in the room for another 4 minutes, entering numbers into the system, checking the drain once more even though she had checked it 40 minutes earlier. Then she told Tomas she was stepping out for 5 minutes, walked down the hallway, pushed open the emergency stairwell door, and let it close behind her. There was no one in the stairwell. The lights were the cold white kind that never turned off, and the only sound was the steady hum of the ventilation fan somewhere above. Maeve leaned her back against the wall, held both hands out in front of her, and looked at them. Then she stopped holding them still. She hadn't allowed herself to do this once in 11 months, not even on the night she stood for 3 hours and 40 minutes beneath the red light outside the operating room. And now, alone in the emergency stairwell at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, she stood perfectly still and let both of her hands shake. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Maeve went into the staff break room to get a cup of water, and Aldo Mancuso was sitting there. He sat in the plastic chair near the window, his coat folded neatly across his knees, his hands resting one over the other, and he sat with the stillness of a man who had been there long enough for the room itself to grow accustomed to his presence. No one was with him. The break room door had an electronic lock, and that lock didn't open without an employee badge. Maeve looked at him, then at the door behind her, and understood that asking how he had gotten in would be a meaningless question. Miss Donnelly. He said her name very softly, and he stood as he said it. I apologize for doing this way. I could have waited until morning and asked to speak with you properly downstairs in the lobby, but by morning someone else would see us talking. I didn't think that would be good for you. Who are you? I work for the Adesi family. I have for 32 years. He pulled out the second chair, turned it to face him, then stepped back so she could decide for herself whether she wanted to sit. I won't keep you long. You can stand if you prefer. Maeve didn't sit. Mrs. Adesi is asleep. If you want to ask about her condition, there will be a doctor here during the day. I'm not asking about her. Aldo reached into the pocket of his coat, and Maeve felt the muscles in her shoulders tighten. What he took out was a sheet of paper. He placed it on the plastic table between them, turned the top of the page toward her, and didn't push it any farther. It was a small sheet of ruled paper, yellowed along the folds, the kind people used to record cash wages in places that paid employees by the week. 3 columns: date, hours, amount, 3 weeks, and at the top of the page, written in blue ballpoint ink that had almost completely faded, was a name. Maeve looked at that line and said nothing. Me. Donnelly. Aldo read without needing to look down. 3 weeks of work. Evening shift. Adesi's restaurant. Federal Hill. This came from a ledger the police never took because they weren't interested in the timesheets of a restaurant that had burned down. He allowed just enough silence to settle between them. The 3rd week ends on December 11th. You know why it ends there. Maeve still said nothing. The compression glove on her left hand felt tighter than usual tonight, or perhaps she was only imagining it. I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking, and I'm going to say it plainly, because we're both tired. His voice kept that same careful politeness, and it was precisely that politeness that made the room feel colder. You were there the night my former employer died. You left the scene before the police arrived, and no one ever took your statement. 10 years later, you appear on the exact hospital floor where my employer's mother is staying. You're the only person on that floor she listens to. Then 3 nights ago, her son was admitted to the hospital, and the person assigned to sit with him for 48 hours in a room containing only the 2 of them is also you. He tilted his head slightly. Give me one reason not to think what I'm thinking. Maeve had considered staying silent. She had stayed silent with Dr. Kessler in the medication room, had stayed silent in front of a newspaper article lying face down on a counter for 5 hours, and she knew the price of choosing silence one more time here. This man wouldn't become angry. He would nod, apologize for disturbing her, leave, and fill in the blank himself with the worst possible version. I used to work there, she said. 3 weeks. Evening shift. I was 18, and it was my first job. You remember my employer. I met him 3 times. He paid us in envelopes, and he called me the new girl. And that night, Maeve looked directly into his eyes. I was there, and I'm not saying anything more about that night, not to you or anyone else. Why? Because that belongs to me. Aldo Mancuso studied her for a long moment. In 32 years, he had sat across from many people in small rooms, at hours when no one wanted to be awake. And he had learned that people who lied usually said more than necessary, while people hiding something real said less and looked more directly at you. He picked up the paper, folded it along its old creases, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. "Thank you for telling me the truth about the part you could tell me." He draped the coat over his arm, walked toward the door, then stopped and turned his head. "There is one thing I think you should know." His voice was still as quiet as when he first entered. "I didn't just find this paper. I found your name on it 7 years ago. It has been sitting in my desk drawer ever since." He opened the door. "I hope the rest of your shift stays quiet." The door closed. Maeve stood alone in the staff break room with the cup she had never filled, and inside her mind the same question repeated itself 3 times in a row, without finding anywhere to rest. If that man had known her name for 7 years, then what had he been doing with it all that time? On the 3rd night after the surgery, at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, Maeve returned to the enhanced monitoring room and found the armchair beside the window empty. The blanket had been folded. The slippers were still beneath the chair. She checked the bathroom. No one was there. She went into the hallway and asked Tomas, and he said he hadn't seen anyone past the nurse's station. The elevator required badge access after midnight. That left only one place. Maeve pushed open the emergency stairwell door at the end of the east wing and went down. She found Mrs. Adesi on the landing between the 3rd and 4th floors, sitting on the 4th step from the bottom, both hands resting on her knees, her bare feet on the cold concrete. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't crying. She was sitting very straight, and when Maeve reached her, she lifted her head and looked directly into her eyes. "I'm not lost, Mrs. Adesi said. "I came down here to talk to you without him in the room." Maeve stopped on the top step. There was something different in the old woman's voice that night. This illness sometimes did that, without warning and never for long. It opened a door for 20 minutes, then closed it again, and no one knew why. Families called them moments of return. In the profession, people didn't call them anything, because once you gave them a name, you had to explain to the family that they didn't mean the patient was getting better. "Your feet are cold. Let's go back to the room and talk there." "No." She patted the step beside her. "Sit down." Maeve sat. The old woman reached over, took Maeve's left hand, and drew it into her lap. Then she began removing the compression glove. She did it slowly, with fingers that were no longer nimble, easing it down little by little from the wrist. Maeve could have pulled her hand away at any point during those 15 seconds. She had withdrawn her hand from Mrs. Adesi's many times before, one finger at a time, at the end of every episode of agitation. And she knew exactly how to do it without making the woman feel abandoned. She didn't pull away. The glove slipped free. Maeve's left palm lay exposed beneath the cold white stairwell light. The skin that would never lie smooth again running across from the base of her thumb to the outer edge of her hand and curling up over 3 fingers. Mrs. Adesi didn't flinch. She didn't make a sound of sympathy. She only looked at it, gave one very small nod, and Maeve understood that the old woman wasn't discovering anything new. She was confirming something she had believed for a long time. "I knew it," she said. "I knew from the day you helped me up in the bathroom and reached out with your left hand first. People always offer their dominant hand, and yours is your right. You gave me your left because you're used to keeping your right hand free to do something else." I remembered that. She kept Maeve's hand in her lap and began to tell her story. 10 years ago, my boy was in the hospital for 3 months. Not this hospital, the old one on the south side, the place they've torn down now. I sat in that hallway every day, from morning until they made me go home. She stopped, rearranging something somewhere inside her memory, then continued. "A girl came, twice, very young. I don't think she was even 20. She sat on the row of waiting chairs about 4 or 5 steps from his door, and she stayed there for a very long time. The first time, I thought she was waiting for family in the next room, but she never looked at the next room. She watched my boy's door, and she never went inside." "Did you speak to her?" "The second time, I did. I brought her a cup of coffee from the vending machine because I'd seen her sitting there since noon. Her left hand was wrapped in bandages, thick bandages, the kind hospitals use for burns. I asked if she knew my son. She said she didn't. I asked who she was then, what her name was. Mrs. Adesi gave a very faint laugh, the laugh of someone remembering something old and still finding it strange. She hesitated, then she said one word, "Bertie," just that one word. I asked for her full name, and she stood up, thanked me for the coffee, and left. I never saw her again. The stairwell was silent for a long time. The only sound was the steady hum of the ventilation fan somewhere above them. "Afterward, I told him," the old woman said. "When my boy was fully awake and started looking for that person, I told him. I said, I met her. I saw her face. I remember her left hand was bandaged. I told him over and over, a dozen times." She looked down at the hand resting in her lap, but by then I had already started forgetting things. I forgot the neighbors' names. I forgot where I put my keys. Some days I called him by his father's name, so he listened to me talk about the girl in the hallway. Then he held my hand and said, "Mom, you're confused." She said it without bitterness. She said it calmly, as though reading a line from her own medical chart. For 10 years he has searched everywhere. He hired people, asked questions, spent money, and the only person who had ever seen that girl's face was sitting right there in his own kitchen. He didn't believe me once. She placed the glove in Maeve's palm and closed Maeve's fingers around it. "Now you tell me, before my head closes the door again. I don't know how much longer I have." Maeve had taken the old woman back to her room at 3:45, tucked the blanket around her, and hadn't told her a single word. Not because she intended to hide anything. By the time the old woman asked that question, the door had already begun to close, and 3 minutes later she was calling Maeve by her daughter's name. The next morning, she remembered nothing, not even that she had gone down the stairwell barefoot. At 7 o'clock that evening, Maeve came on shift and changed the surgical dressing for the patient in the enhanced monitoring room. He was awake. Not the drifting, half-conscious wakefulness of the previous 2 days, but truly awake, his eyes following her hands as she moved. He watched her remove the old dressing, watched her clean the wound, watched her place fresh gauze. He didn't ask whether it hurt or didn't hurt, didn't ask when he could leave the hospital, didn't ask any of the questions patients usually asked. Only after she had secured the final edge of the dressing did he speak. "People are usually afraid of me." Maeve removed her medical gloves, dropped them into the bin, and didn't look up immediately. "People come into this room and stay close to the wall," he continued. "Doctors talk to me faster than they need to. The kid who brought the meal cart yesterday put the tray down and backed away without turning his back on me. You don't." He paused for a beat. Why? There were many things she could have said in that moment. She could have told him that in here he was a patient, and nothing else. The answer every nurse knew by heart. She could have said she was busy, but she had spent nearly an hour in the emergency stairwell the night before. And there were nights after which a person no longer had enough strength left to choose the kindest answer. "Because I've been afraid of things much worse than you." He didn't ask anything else. That was the part Maeve hadn't expected, and it unsettled her more than any question could have. He only looked at her, and she realized that his gaze had moved away from her face and settled on her left hand, on the compression glove she had put back on before beginning her shift. His eyes stayed there for more than a second. Then he closed them, and within 2 minutes, he was asleep again, the way people recovering from major surgery slept between doses of medication, without warning. Maeve cleared the tray, dimmed the lights, and left the room with the feeling of someone who had just crossed a sheet of thin ice without yet hearing it crack. 3 hours earlier, in a room 8 kilometers from the hospital, Aldo Mancuso had placed a thin file on the wooden table in front of the man sitting in the chair his father had once occupied. Nico wasn't home, but meetings in this family continued even while the man presiding over them was in the hospital, and papers were brought to his room for signature during afternoon visiting hours. Aldo had waited until only the 2 of them remained. "I had the entire 4th floor checked again," he said. 39 employees. 38 of them have clean, long, boring records. He opened the file. The 39th doesn't. Nico didn't pick up the file. He only looked at it. Critical care nurse. 2 years flying medical transport. Then suddenly she leaves all of it for night shifts in memory care at 1/3 less pay. No husband. No children. No relatives in this state. Before that, 4 years in emergency medicine. And before that, her record is so thin there's almost nothing there. Aldo turned a page. "And 10 years ago, she worked as a server for 3 weeks at your father's restaurant. She was there that night. She left before the police arrived." Nico looked up. It was the first time during the entire conversation that he changed his posture. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Cash payroll. "I asked her, and she admitted it." "What did she say about that night?" "She said she was there, and she wouldn't say anything else." Aldo closed the file. "Mr. Nico, I've been doing this for 32 years. A person appearing in the right place at the right time once is coincidence. Twice is a plan. This is 3 times. Your mother is hospitalized, and she gets assigned to care for her. You end up in the hospital, and she gets assigned to sit with you for 48 hours in a room containing only the 2 of you." He let the silence settle. "And your car. I had someone go back over that stretch of road. Dry pavement. Straight road. No other vehicles. You've been driving for 20 years and never hit anyone. Then suddenly you lose control." Nico sat very still. "You think someone is behind this. I think someone has planted a person inside the family's reach. And I think that crash wasn't an accident." A long silence followed. Nico looked toward the hospital room window, where darkness had already fallen outside, then spoke in a low voice without the slightest hesitation. "Get ready." Don't do anything until I tell you, but get ready." "Yes," Aldo answered immediately. Then he picked up the file, nodded, and walked toward the door. He had been taking orders from this man for 15 years, and from his father for 17 years before that. And in all 32 of those years, he had always looked directly into the eyes of the person giving the order when he said yes. That afternoon, he didn't. At 2:47 in the morning, Maeve was standing at the foot of the bed, entering urine output into the tablet, when she looked up for a reason she would never later be able to explain to anyone. On the monitor, every number was still within acceptable limits. Pulse 102, blood pressure 106/68, oxygen saturation 93. There was no alarm sounding at all. She set the tablet down and moved toward the head of the bed. He was breathing faster than he had 20 minutes earlier. Not much faster, but faster, and shallow. And there was something in the rise of his chest that made the right side and the left no longer look the same. She picked up her stethoscope. On the right, breath sounds were clear. On the left, she moved the diaphragm down to 3 separate places and heard nothing at all. Not diminished. Nothing. She placed 2 fingers in the hollow at the base of his throat, just above the sternum, and located the trachea. It wasn't centered. It had shifted to the right. In his neck, both veins stood out clearly beneath the skin, in a way they had no business standing out in a man lying with the head of the bed elevated 30 degrees. On the monitor, the blood pressure changed, 94/58. Maeve hit the call alarm and reached for the radio at the same time. East Wing monitoring room. Need a doctor immediately. Suspected left tension pneumothorax after surgery. The voice answering from the surgical call room said the on-call physician was in an operating room on the 2nd floor with a ruptured organ case. Estimated arrival 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Maeve looked at the monitor. 88/52. Tomas and another nurse ran in, pushing the emergency cart behind them. At the same moment, the door opened a second time and Dr. Whitman Kessler stepped inside, his white coat thrown hastily over the clothes he had been sleeping in. One side of his hair still flattened. He had turned on alerts for every new entry made in this room's chart, and the automated notification had reached him at 2:48. Status: complete loss of breath sounds on the left, tracheal deviation to the right, distended neck veins, blood pressure falling, currently 88/52. 15 minutes ago it was 106. Oxygen saturation 89, and still dropping. Maeve delivered it all in one steady stream without stumbling. Tension pneumothorax. He needs needle decompression. Second intercostal space. Left midclavicular line. Kessler stepped to the head of the bed and placed his own stethoscope against the patient's chest. He listened. Then he put his fingers at the base of the throat. Maeve had already turned toward the emergency cart and was opening the 3rd drawer. "Tomas, outside. Both of you, out. Close the door, and don't let anyone in." Tomas froze. "But if you need help, if I need you, I'll call. Right now I need space." Out. The door closed, leaving only 3 people in the room, one of whom was losing his blood pressure. Kessler lowered the stethoscope. "You're right. I know." Maeve tore open a package and took out a 14-gauge catheter, holding it in her right hand. "The on-call doctor is still 7 minutes away. He doesn't have 7 minutes. Miss Donnelly, you're a nurse." "I know what I am." She looked up, and for the first time in 11 months inside this building, she didn't lower her voice. "Then you do it, doctor. Right now. You're standing here. You have hands. You have the degree. You do it. Or you step back and let me do it. Because in 90 seconds his heart is going to stop. And then no one in this room will need to argue about scope of practice anymore." Whitman Kessler stood still. 20 seconds. He was a neurologist. The last time he had held a needle to perform this procedure had been in a brightly lit training room on a plastic mannequin 27 years earlier. He knew that exactly. And he knew that the woman holding the needle had performed this procedure inside the cabin of a helicopter while it was banking. And he also knew that if he said the next words, his name would be in the incident report. On the monitor, 81/49. "Do it," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Talk me through every step." Maeve had already finished disinfecting the skin. Left clavicle, down 2 intercostal spaces. Midclavicular line, stay just over the upper border of the lower rib to avoid the neurovascular bundle. She counted with her fingertips. Going in. The needle passed through skin, through muscle, and stopped for half a second. Then Maeve advanced it a little farther, and there was a hiss. Not loud, only the sound of air escaping from somewhere it had no right to be. Steady and drawn out, lasting about 4 seconds before fading. The left side of Nicholas Adesi's chest settled downward. Maeve withdrew the needle, left the catheter in place, secured it with tape, and only then looked up at the monitor. 87/52, then 95/58, then 102/60. The oxygen saturation climbed from 87 to 94. Kessler breathed out, and Maeve heard it. "Call the on-call physician. He still needs a chest tube," she said. Then she bent down, placed a hand on the patient's shoulder to keep him still while she adjusted the intravenous line. And she did it with her left hand, because her right was still holding the tubing connection. The compression glove had been in her pocket since the moment she tore open the needle package, and needed full sensation in her fingertips. Nicholas Adesi opened his eyes. He came awake the way people do when blood has just begun reaching where it needs to reach again. Slowly at first, then all at once. His right hand rose and closed around Maeve's wrist. Not hard, only enough to keep her there. He didn't look up at her face. He looked down at the bare hand resting on his shoulder, at the skin that would never lie smooth again, running across her palm and curling over 3 fingers, and he stared at it for a very long time. "I know this hand," he said. The on-call physician arrived 4 minutes later and placed the chest tube at 3:10. By 6 o'clock, the left lung had fully re-expanded, and they rescanned his entire chest and abdomen to make sure there was no other source of air leakage. Whitman Kessler didn't go back to the call room to sleep. He sat in the radiology reading room on the 2nd floor from 6:15 until 8 o'clock. And he didn't look only at the new scans. He pulled up the entire series from the night of admission. The set everyone had reviewed quickly at 1:20 in the morning because at that moment there had been only one question that mattered: whether there was blood in the abdomen. At 9 o'clock, he asked to speak with the patient, and he brought a laptop with him. There were 3 people in the monitoring room then. Nicholas Adesi was propped in a half-sitting position, fully awake, the chest tube still in place on his left side. Aldo Mancuso stood at the foot of the bed with his coat draped over one arm, and he had been standing there since 7. Maeve Donnelly's shift had ended 2 hours earlier and she still hadn't gone home. She was finishing handoff in the corner of the room, and no one had given her permission to leave yet. "I want to talk to you about the cause," Kessler said, opening the laptop and turning the screen so all 3 of them could see. "The night you came in, all of us did the same thing. We saw a man who had just crashed his car, with a rigid abdomen, low blood pressure, and blood in the abdominal cavity on ultrasound. We concluded that the impact had ruptured your spleen, and we operated. That was the right decision, and it saved your life. But it doesn't answer the question of why." He advanced to the second image. "This is an axial view of the left upper abdomen taken before surgery. Look here." He moved the cursor toward an irregular, faintly bright area running along the lower border of the organ. "This is scar tissue. It isn't new. Tissue like this takes years to thicken to this degree, and its density tells me it has probably been there for about 10 years. You had an old injury in this area, and it healed, but it healed by leaving a band of fibrous tissue adherent to the vascular pedicle." Aldo stepped half a pace closer for a better look. "Now this." Kessler changed the image. Against that scarred tissue, the wall of the splenic artery was pulled and distorted. It bulged outward into a small sac. In medicine, we call that an aneurysm. The vessel wall here was much thinner than normal, and it had been thinning gradually for years without causing any symptoms. No pain, no fever, no warning at all. A person can carry something like this and go about his life normally until the day it can't hold anymore. The room was very quiet. Now we come to the important part. Kessler placed 2 images side by side. If an impact had ruptured your spleen, we would expect to see bruising of the splenic tissue, corresponding rib fractures, injury to the abdominal wall on that side. You have none of those things. Your ribs are intact. There's no bruising of the abdominal wall. The seatbelt left only a very light mark, exactly the kind we see in a low-speed collision. He raised his eyes and looked directly at the patient. "The blood in your abdomen didn't come from the crash, Mr. Adesi. It came from that aneurysm. It ruptured first, while you were driving. You lost blood very quickly. You lost consciousness within seconds, and the car kept moving without anyone truly driving it." No one spoke for a long time. "The collision with the median was the result," Kessler said, "not the cause. If you had been sitting at home that night, you still would have bled in exactly the same way, except there would have been no one to call an ambulance, and we would have received you 40 minutes later." Nicholas Adesi stared at the screen for a very long time. Then he asked a question, and his voice sounded nothing like the voice of the man who had issued orders in this room the previous afternoon. "That old injury, you said 10 years. Around that. Could be 8, could be 12. I can't estimate it more precisely than that." He closed the laptop. "But if you were ever crushed by something heavy in this area, or had a penetrating injury here that was treated under less than ideal conditions, that's where I would begin looking." Aldo Mancuso was standing at the foot of the bed, and he wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking down at the floor. Inside his mind, the pieces had just broken loose from their old positions and fallen into a different arrangement, and that new arrangement made him feel cold. Dry pavement, straight road, no other vehicles. A man who had driven for 20 years without ever hitting anyone, then suddenly lost control. Aldo had presented those 3 details as evidence of a conspiracy, and he had presented them very convincingly, and now he understood that those 3 details proved only one thing, that the man behind the wheel that night had lost consciousness before the car ever left its lane. There was no one behind it, no enemy. No one had planted anyone inside the family. The night 10 years earlier hadn't ended in December of that year. It had only slowed down, then lain silent inside this man's abdomen for 10 years, and the week before, it had tried once again. Aldo said "excuse me" very quietly, pulled his coat over his shoulders, and stepped into the hallway. He walked to the end of the corridor, where a window looked down over the parking lot, and took out his phone. The first call lasted 11 seconds. He said only 3 things. "Stop everything. Put everything away. No one touches anyone until I call again." The second call lasted longer, and by the end of it he had to repeat twice that yes, he meant exactly what he had said, and no, there was no change of plan, because there had never been a plan worth carrying out in the first place. Then he put the phone away and stood at that window for a long time. In 32 years, Aldo Mancuso had prevented many terrible things by knowing beforehand. This time, it hadn't been him. This time, the thing standing between Federal Hill and a war against an enemy who had never existed was a night shift nurse who had looked up at 2:47 in the morning when not a single number on the monitor had sounded an alarm, and had recognized what the machine would take another 8 minutes to finally admit. The summons arrived at the end of the following shift, printed on letterhead bearing the words "Clinical Compliance Office," and the appointment time was 7 o'clock in the morning. Maeve went straight down to the second floor from her shift, without even having time to change. The room was small and windowless, with 1 long table and 3 people seated on the other side. Priscilla Vaughn sat in the middle, the director of compliance, her silver hair cut short, a file in front of her already marked with tabs in 4 places. To her left sat someone from Human Resources Maeve had never met before. To her right sat Dr. Whitman Kessler. "Please sit down, Miss Donnelly. This isn't a disciplinary hearing. This is an incident documentation meeting, and everything you say here will be entered into the record." Mrs. Vaughn opened the file. "On the night of the 17th, at approximately 2:50 in the morning, you performed an invasive procedure on the patient in the East Wing Enhanced Monitoring Room, needle decompression of the pleural space. Do you deny that?" "No." "Were you trained to perform that procedure?" "Yes." "Where?" "In the Advanced Trauma Emergency Program, and later during the 2 years I worked on an air critical care transport team. I had performed the procedure 7 times before, 6 times inside a helicopter in flight, once on the ground." The Human Resources representative looked up. "But your state nursing license doesn't permit you to perform that procedure in a hospital setting without a physician's order." "I know. You knew, and you did it anyway." "Yes." Mrs. Vaughn turned a page. "I want to go back to something else first, because it's in your personnel file, and it relates to how we assess the decision you made that night." She read from the document. "On June 29th of last year, a medical helicopter crashed in Kent County. Your name appears on the crew manifest." Maeve placed both hands on her thighs beneath the table, where no one could see them. "Yes." "Can you tell us what happened?" "There were 4 of us on board. 1 pilot, 1 physician, 1 nurse, and me. We were en route to a truck accident west of the city. 11 o'clock at night, raining, poor visibility. We lost the engine at low altitude." She spoke in the voice of someone reciting a report she had read too many times. "I got out of the cabin first because the door on my side broke open on impact. I went back, and I did what I could until the fire department arrived 19 minutes later. The room was silent. I was the only person who walked out of that field." Mrs. Vaughn didn't ask for any further details. She asked only one question. "Afterward, you took 4 months off, then applied here and requested the night shift in memory care. Why memory care, Miss Donnelly?" And this was where Maeve answered truthfully, for the first time since she had walked into this building. "Because I couldn't leave nursing. I tried. I sat at home for 4 months, and I couldn't do anything else. My hands still went through every step on their own whenever I heard an ambulance siren outside." She looked up. "But I couldn't go back to where I had been, so I looked for somewhere dark enough. Somewhere the work was still about caring for people, but no one would die because I made the wrong decision in 30 seconds. Mrs. Vaughn wrote down a line. "Dr. Kessler hadn't said anything from the beginning. Maeve didn't say a single word about a December night 10 years earlier, and no one in that room asked her about it, because no one in that room knew it existed. All right, Mrs. Vaughn turned to the final section of the file. Now we'll address the incident itself. I'm going to read aloud the statement, Doctor. Kessler submitted at 10 o'clock the following morning. Because this is the document the review board will rely on. She began to read. The statement was accurate. It recorded the correct time, the correct clinical signs, the correct sequence of events. It stated that Nurse Donnelly had identified the patient's deterioration before the monitor alarmed. And it said so plainly, without diminishing what she had done. It stated that the on-call physician was still 8 minutes away. It stated that the patient survived. Then Mrs. Vaughn reached the paragraph describing the procedure itself, and Maeve sat waiting for the next sentence. The next sentence stated that Nurse Donnelly had instructed all other staff members to leave the patient's room, and then proceeded to perform needle decompression. Mrs. Vaughn finished reading that paragraph. Then she continued into the section about chest tube placement after the on-call physician arrived. There wasn't a single word about those 20 seconds. There wasn't a single word about, do it. Talk me through every step. On paper, in that room, at that moment, only one person had made the decision, and that person had personally sent every other witness out of the room before carrying it out. Mrs. Vaughn finished reading, folded the page closed, and looked up. Would you like to add anything to this statement, Miss Donnelly? Maeve didn't answer immediately. She turned her head to the right and looked directly at Dr. Whitman Kessler, sitting 1.5 meters away, both hands resting one over the other on the tabletop. He didn't look back at her. He looked down at the table, at the empty stretch of wood between his hands, and he remained that way. Nicholas Adesi told her the following afternoon, when she went in to remove the chest tube, and there were only the two of them in the room. He didn't ask who she was. He only said he wanted to tell her something. And he told it in the even voice of a man who had replayed the story in his own mind too many times. He said that 10 years earlier, on a December night, he had been 24 years old and inside his father's restaurant when everything went wrong. He said he had been pinned beneath a fallen beam near the middle of the dining room, while his father was farther back, near the kitchen, and he couldn't see anything because the smoke had thickened so quickly. He said a girl had gone back inside against the flow. He hadn't seen her face clearly. What he remembered were 2 hands pressing down on the place where his chest was bleeding, and a woman's voice counting his breaths for him. 4 counts in and 4 counts held, over and over until that voice went hoarse. Then he told her the hardest part. I screamed at her to leave me. I told her my father was in the kitchen, to go find him first. I shouted it at least 3 times. I remember that clearly because my throat burned for 2 weeks afterward. He looked up at the ceiling. She didn't go. She stayed with me until the firefighters got inside. My father didn't make it out. He was silent for a long time. I've lived with that for 10 years. Someone stood between 2 doorways, and that person chose me. I don't know her name. I never saw her face, and I never got to ask her why she chose the way she did. Maeve finished removing the chest tube, covered the site with a dressing, and left the room without being able to say a single word. 3 days later, she drove across the city to a 2-story nursing home behind a lawn that had already turned yellow, and she sat in her car for 20 minutes before going inside. She had known this address for 7 years. She had looked it up the year she took her critical care certification exam, written it on a scrap of paper, and that scrap had followed her through 4 moves without ever once being used. Room 11 was on the ground floor. The door was open. The man sat in an armchair beside the window, 70 years old, thin, with a small oxygen tube looped over his ears and resting beneath his nose, connected to a machine on the floor that hummed steadily. He was watching some program on the television mounted to the wall. The volume turned very low. "Hello, sir," Maeve said from the doorway. "May I come in?" Walter Price turned his head. He narrowed his eyes at her for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Maeve knew he didn't recognize this face. The face that had aged 10 years since the last time he had seen it. Then his expression changed. It changed before his eyes had fully recognized anything. "Say that again," he said. "Say what you just said. May I come in?" He placed one hand on the arm of the chair and sat straighter. The new girl. His voice was rough, and every sentence had to be divided between 2 breaths. The girl from the evening shift. The one who used to save bread for me to take home. Maeve had to grip the doorframe. He pointed to the chair across from him, and she sat down, and for a long time neither of them said anything. Then he asked how she had been living, and she told him she was a nurse, and he nodded as though he had known that news for 10 years already. "I'm sorry," she said. "I've known this address for 7 years. I never came." Why? Maeve looked down at her left hand resting in her lap. Because that night I only got one person out. Walter Price looked at her. Then he did something she hadn't expected at all. He laughed, not mockingly. It was a short, tired laugh. The laugh of a man who had just heard something he had suspected for a long time and still found painful to hear. Girl, he said, you think you chose. I don't understand. Listen to me. He stopped to catch his breath. I was awake. I was awake through all of it. The dish cabinet came down across me, and I was trapped underneath it. I couldn't pull my legs free, but I could see everything. He raised his right hand, trembling, and pushed it forward as though shoving something away. You ran in as far as the turn. You stopped there. To the left was me and the boss. To the right was the young man under the beam. You stood there, and you couldn't move. I watched you standing there, and I knew you couldn't decide. He lowered his hand. I could reach out about this far. I caught the leg of your pants, and I pushed you to the right. The only sound left in the room was the oxygen machine humming on the floor. You didn't choose, child, Walter Price said. I chose for you, because I could see both sides and you couldn't. And I knew it was already too late on the left. The boss was 3 steps away from me, and I had been calling to him from the moment that cabinet came down, and he never answered me once. Maeve sat perfectly still. For 10 years, she had carried a question inside herself that she had never dared ask aloud. And now someone had just answered it in a room with a television playing softly and an oxygen machine humming on the floor. You got one person out, he said. Listen carefully to me. That wasn't failure. That was arithmetic. There were 4 people inside that building that night, and the arithmetic came out to 2 people still breathing. Me and him. And both of us were breathing because of a decision you never actually made. He reached across and placed his thin hand over her left one, directly on the skin that would never lie smooth again. And that arithmetic, he said, is still breathing today. Nicholas Edesi was discharged on the 11th day, and by the 13th he was already sitting behind the wooden desk in the second-floor room of the house on Federal Hill, even though the doctor had told him 3 weeks. That afternoon, Aldo Mancuso asked to speak with him alone, and he asked in a way he never had before, which was to say he knocked on the door and waited until he was invited inside. He placed 2 things on the desk. The first was a sheet of ruled paper, yellowed along the folds. The second was a thin file with a stiff cover, the kind people used many years ago, and no one seemed to sell anymore. I've shown you this one already, he said, resting his hand on the payroll sheet. But not this. Nico didn't pick it up. He looked at the 2 things lying beside each other, then at the 61-year-old man standing in front of his desk. Sit down, Uncle Aldo. I'll stand. He cleared his throat. 7 years ago, I found the name on that sheet of paper. Not 7 months. 7 years. The room went very quiet. I searched for 3 years, just as you told me to. I traced the timesheet. I found the name. And from the name, I found the person. I knew she had left the city. I knew she had gone to nursing school. One April morning in Warwick, I stood about 20 meters away from her in a parking lot. He stopped. Then I came back and told you the trail had gone cold. Nico said nothing. He only placed both hands on the desk. Before you ask, I'll tell you now. No one paid me. No one told me to do it. There was no faction behind it. Then why? Aldo Mancuso was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. Because during those 3 years of searching, I found something else you never asked me to find. He pushed the stiff covered file forward. This is a copy of the fire department's scene report. The complete report, not the version they read to the family that day. I got it in the 3rd year. There's a page describing where each person was found and what condition they were in when the firefighters entered. And there's one line about your father. He didn't open the file. Your father couldn't have been saved, mister. Nico, not by then. It happened when the kitchen ceiling came down, and that happened before that girl ever stepped back inside. They wrote it in technical language, but it means only one thing. Nico sat completely still. If I found her and brought her back here, she would tell you what she saw in that kitchen that night, and you would understand something. Aldo looked directly into his eyes for the first time that afternoon. That thing you shouted that night, the thing you yelled at her, telling her to leave you and save your father first. You've lived for 10 years believing someone heard that and chose not to obey. You were angry with her, then grateful to her, then angry and grateful at the same time, and you kept looking for her because you needed to know why. His voice dropped lower. But that isn't what happened. Nico didn't move. The truth is that the last order you shouted that night was an order no one in this world could have carried out. It wasn't that she didn't listen. There was nothing left for her to obey. Aldo paused. I knew that, and I sat in my car in that Warwick parking lot that morning, watched that girl walk into the building, and asked myself one question. If I bring her back, what do you get? You get to learn that for 10 years you've been searching for an answer that tells you only one thing, that there was nothing else you could have done. Some people can live with that, some can't. He was silent for a while. You were 27 then, and you had just taken this whole house onto your shoulders. I didn't think you could. He pushed the payroll sheet a little farther toward Nico. So I let you keep searching, because searching was easier to live with than knowing. When a man is searching, he still has something to do every morning. The only sound in the room was the clock on the wall. Nicholas Adesi sat there for a very long time. Long enough that Aldo had already prepared 3 different sentences in his mind to say next, and didn't use a single one of them. Nico didn't strike the desk. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask, "How dare you?" or "Do you understand what you just told me?" or any of the questions a man in his position was entitled to ask. He asked only one question, and his voice was very quiet. "How many times did my mother tell me?" Aldo Mancuso opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. Because he had been there too, in the kitchen of this house, on many afternoons over those 10 years. He had stood in the doorway and listened to the old woman talk about the girl sitting in the hospital hallway, with her left hand wrapped in bandages, telling the story again and again, telling it during the years when she could still remember everything else clearly. And he had watched Nico take his mother's hand and say, "Mom, you're confused." And Aldo had said nothing, not once. In 32 years, there had never been a question from this man that he couldn't answer. He stood there with both hands hanging at his sides, and he couldn't answer this one. 3 weeks later, St. Brigid's Disciplinary Review Board convened for its second hearing, and this time the room was no longer small. The first person invited to speak was a 68-year-old woman named Dorothy Pruitt, a retired Providence fire captain whom Dr. Whitman Kessler had spent 10 days tracking down after reading a single line in an old medical record, referring to an abdominal injury approximately 10 years old. She brought with her a faded incident file and read from it in the voice of someone accustomed to presenting reports before rooms full of people. Female, approximately 18 years old. 2nd degree burns to the left palm and 3 fingers. Found inside the hazardous area when fire crews approached, maintaining pressure on the wound of a male victim trapped beneath a fallen structural element. Advised by medical personnel to be transported to the hospital. Refused treatment. Left the scene before a statement could be obtained. Mrs. Pruitt closed the file and lifted her eyes to the room. She said that on the final line of that page, in her own handwriting, she had written 4 words, "Unidentified female civilian," and that she had hated those 4 words for 10 years, because in 31 years on the job, she had entered many dangerous places, and had seen only one person going back inside, while everyone else was trying to get out. The second person to speak was Dr. Whitman Kessler, and he asked to submit a revised statement, voluntarily, bearing his signature. He read the added section in a calm voice, that he had been present in the patient's room at 2:50 in the morning, that he had examined the patient himself and confirmed the diagnosis before the procedure was performed, that he had stood still for 20 seconds, and that he had been the one who said the 2 words, "Do it." Mrs. Priscilla Vaughn asked why those lines hadn't appeared in the original statement. Kessler answered that he had left them out because he couldn't bear to see them written down. He said that in 20 years of practicing medicine, he had believed that credentials and competence were the same thing, that one guaranteed the other, and that he had built his entire career on that belief. Then he said the final sentence, and he said it very slowly. "That night in that room, I was the one with the credentials. She was the one with the competence." The board ruled that the circumstances constituted an emergency, waived every form of disciplinary action, and did something St. Brigid's had never done before. They created a new position, Night Rapid Response Coordinator, and wrote into the decision that the role would report directly to the department chief. The proposal had been written by Dr. Whitman Kessler. That same week, Nicholas Adesi stood in the hospital lobby, wearing ordinary clothes for the first time since Maeve had met him, and announced a foundation bearing his father's name. The foundation wouldn't build a hospital, and it wouldn't put anyone's name on a wall. It would fund one program only: overnight caregiver support for families with loved ones living with dementia, so no one would have to spend months sleeping in an armchair beside a hospital bed without anyone to relieve them. He spoke briefly. He said that within 2 years his mother would forget his name, and he wanted there to be time for her to remember one kind thing before that happened. His mother, Nella Adesi, sat in a wheelchair beside him, and when he finished speaking, she reached out and took her son's hand, then turned to the other side and took the hand of the woman in a white coat standing slightly behind them. She held both hands in hers, and she said, clearly, "Maeve," exactly once. For 11 months, Maeve had introduced herself by name every time she entered that room, and for 11 months Mrs. Adesi hadn't remembered it once. That night, Maeve Donnelly returned to the 4th floor. She started her shift at 7 o'clock in the evening, received handoff, checked the patient list, and pushed the medication cart into the hallway. Her left hand was bare. The skin that would never lie smooth again remained visible beneath the white hallway lights, and she no longer covered it. There is one thing this story leaves behind. A person's title tells us only what they have carried on their shoulders before. It can never tell us what they will be capable of doing in that room, on the night everything goes wrong, when only 90 seconds remain. And sometimes, the person the whole world believes is no longer fully aware is the only one who was telling the truth from the very beginning, simply because no one was willing to sit down at eye level and listen. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the person who came to mind while you were listening, so we can continue discovering compelling stories together every day. We would truly love to know how today's story made you feel, so please leave a comment and tell us what you felt deep in your heart, because every one of your comments is read and deeply appreciated. We wish you and your family lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.